let me push our conversation forward. I'm going to introduce again Jim Rounds. Jim, you've been very patient through this whole thing. Thanks for that. Jim, you provide fiscal analysis to communities statewide, and having analyzed the town's finances, you're here to help us recognize the operational cost implications of modifying how Carefree's fire and emergency services are delivered. Now, for everyone who's watching, we should probably, say this might be a little bit technical, a little bit wonky. So, but I also want to encourage everyone watching to pay attention, because the devil's in the details. We need to understand the assumptions and expectations that are built into this. But Jim, I would ask you, as we're going through, I know you've got a whole bunch of information. I peeked ahead at your slides. Just remember that for me as your moderator and for everyone watching, not everyone is as sophisticated in financial analysis as Peter is over here. So kind of dumb it down for us and help us understand what the implications are that are going on here, okay?
Sure, and it doesn't even have to be dumbed down. Really, there's always a story when you're working on a project like this. And we've done hundreds of economic forecasts at broader citywide, statewide levels, individual projects, public policy. And first and foremost, the thing that always creeps up first is past decisions by the government group getting to a certain position that's maybe not favorable, and then that influences what you're recommending. Well, it turns out that this community has been run very well getting up to this point, and so we weren't faced with the additional challenges of how do we backfill a hole that's been created through maybe bad management. So I want to compliment them, and we also were able to hit the ground running because of that review and the effort that the team put in, and what Peter brought up with that Citizens Commission and report. That provided a lot of good information, and Peter is a great resource for the community. He was down at the Capitol when I was at the Capitol. I just was a new person, and he was the very intimidating person walking quickly past us. And he still is to some extent. But there is a story here. And so the good thing is that we don't have to focus on some of this back stuff. We can focus on this topic going forward. And when you're doing forecasts, there's different ways of doing it. You do what people call baseline, and that just means it's a best guess. But there's times to use a best guess, and then there's times to maybe pull it back a little bit. And so whenever we're coming out of a recession, and people tend to under forecast at that point, you would go with a baseline forecast because there's not much risk. You really don't want to estimate revenues that are coming in and then have that be lower than what your expenses are. Huge risk in doing that. And so then you put together a conservative forecast, which is basically a worst case scenario. And then in some cases, depending on the state of the business cycle, we're hearing recession coming. Are we going to have a hard landing? When will we come out of it? What's Arizona going to look like? What's the region here going to look like, the town? And so sometimes you have to employ that, but you have to go through each of the different steps to get to that point. And so on the baseline assumptions, we're talking about a modest recession in 2023. Some people believe that we already entered a recession. I believe that we're on the front end of it, and we're going to have a problematic 2023. But we're going to be okay in Arizona compared to much of the rest of the country, which is typical. We think that the federal government's going to continue some of its infrastructure spending. If it cuts off the spigot too quickly, then it could cause some additional problems. But the Federal Reserve is another uncertainty. What ended up happening is that they made money really easy to get at very low interest rates for too long, and now they're having to raise rates, and it's creating what some people call a Volcker recession, which is what happened after we had very similar policies in the 70s and in the early 80s under Reagan. We had to create our own recession. So essentially we're going through that, which means it could be a little bit more problematic than normal, but the big thing is the uncertainty. If you're uncertain of something, but you want to be confident in what you're forecasting, then you have to be a little bit more conservative with the numbers. So you got to pull them down to be confident. And that's the issue that we're being faced with. And on the conservative scenarios, it's inflation's going to continue for a while longer, not just through 2024, which is the most likely, but through 2025. And another concern is how the US goes, so goes the state, but state policy matters too. What if we see a big shift in being pro-economic development and being conservative? So all these bigger things will impact the forecasts that you use. So these are the things that we keep in the back of our mind when we put together the numbers. Now you have to do the numbers, but the numbers are done to get to that point where you can say, tell that story. Here's what the numbers mean.
Jim, I'm sorry, but before you go on, I wanted to make sure I understand. The reason we even do all of this forecasting and assumptions is to answer if I understand, one fundamental question, which is, are these options affordable? How does the town afford them? Is that right?
Exactly. Costs are going to be a certain level, and you have to make sure that you're going to be able to bring in enough money, because you can't have a long-term situation where you have an imbalance where you're always bringing in less revenue. You can have a reserve fund, so you can have a little bank account set aside so that you can cover some short-term deficits, but it can't happen longer term. So it's, what does the forecast look like compared to what they're going to need to spend? But it's interesting, like I said, because it started in a very favorable position, but a lot of stuff can go awry during this next downturn.
So I just want to make sure, because we started by talking about two fundamental questions. I think we just expanded to three fundamental questions. The first question that, the Citizens Committee helped us understand was this tension between the coverage that we're getting in the community and the cost of that coverage. That's the first two. And now we're saying there's a third element, which is whatever the cost is, there's an affordability question that goes along with it. We need to look at that separate from the price itself.
Exactly. I would love to be driving a Lamborghini down to these meetings, but it's not going to happen because I have a budget, and you can't always spend more than you're bringing in. You have to, this is true in life, it's true with families, it's true with government budgets, it's true with everything. You have to have a balanced budget, and that's also an economic development tool. Communities that are really out of whack when it comes to having a balanced budget, and they're having to do a lot of gimmicks longer term, tend to be the ones that can't locate that next business or bring in a resort or whatever it might be.
Let me make sure I understand your metaphor. You can't afford the price of the Lamborghini, but you also can't afford the financing that would be offered on the Lamborghini, because even that doesn't work for you.
I guess a Lamborghini is a bad example, because I don't think that financing works out in any circumstance for an economist. But the point is, you have to compare what you want to buy from a government perspective, yes, with a reasonable level of revenues coming in. You have to have balance. Okay. You can't just increase spending as much as you want and then raise taxes as much as you want, because you lose that balance, and you have to find that equilibrium.
Thanks. Okay, now I understand why here we're talking about affordability, not price. So let's continue with your analysis.
Sure, and there were some additional items that we had to consider. Whenever, like with the forecast, we brought in a person, Pat Walker, who has 40 years of experience in this area doing public finance, and she was part of our team and looked at a lot of very complicated, this was one of the more complicated analysis that we've done in a while, and we've looked at flat tax issues, Prop 208 issues, everything else. This was one of the most complicated that we've done, and like Peter said, there's a lot of moving parts in these things. So you have to look at, could there be difficulties recruiting any firefighters? You got to deal with contingency reserves. Could cost increases be a little bit more than expected? So we went from not just looking at the revenues, but we took a look at what if there's some variances in the planned spending? Because you have to run these different scenarios to see what kind of a risk there could be. Let's say there's a category where we feel pretty good about it, but it could be 10% higher, we're just not 100% sure. Well, let's see what the math looks like if we raise that cost by 10%, and does that break it? So you have to run a number of scenarios, and that's why we end up creating computer models where you can mess with the different percentages and figure out what that balance is. Whenever I give speeches on economics, I always show this stereo equalizer, and that's that thing where you can slide the frequencies up and down and you get the sound that you like. It's the same thing with the economy. You set tax rates, you have public services like firefighters, everything else. You have to have that right frequency to make the economy tick and do well, and also take care of the needs of the residents.
That's a great metaphor, but it's a lot more sophisticated than turning the volume up to 11.
Correct.
Okay, Peter.
Jim, you titled this slide, Items for Consideration Establishing a Municipal Fire Department. All of your estimates going forward assume, for expense purposes, that Carefree establishes a municipal fire department, right?
Correct.
Okay, and just to remind everybody, rural metros, the cheapest that you can buy, Daisy Mountain, and then you have Carefree and Scottsdale that are basically even at about $3 million a year, plus or minus.
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to, all of these scenarios that we're seeing is utilizing the Carefree fire, a municipal fire department.
Correct, and here's what will be nice going forward when we do the additional public outreach is the way that we set things up is if there's some interesting scenarios that are viable that you all would like to look at, or some great questions come up, we can quickly run some scenarios and see how that bottom line changes over time. So I'm really looking forward to that, because that's the fun part. That's when you're getting public feedback. You're saying, okay, that was a good point. What if we make a change on this? Most of the time we'll be able to do that on the fly and be able to show what the results are, the way it's set up. So I think people will enjoy talking about fire services and economics more than they think, because it is fun when you have an idea and you can see how it impacts different numbers.
Excellent. Let's go through your presentation here.
Okay, so we start with the baseline forecast, and this would be the more optimistic out of the three that we looked at. In this one, we had the cash balance at the end drop significantly in 2027. Going to the numbers though, the baseline forecast, even though that bottom line, so where it says ending fund balance and it has a deficit, you want to look out for any of those numbers turning red. But the problem is, this is not the time to use a baseline forecast, because all the risk is on the downside when you go into a recession.
Right, you said earlier that the baseline was the optimistic forecast here.
Yes, so baseline in this case, at this point in the business cycle, people typically expect to see a baseline and a conservative. Yeah. Nobody really uses an optimistic one anymore, but in this case, this would be the optimistic. And the problem is there's a lot of risk. And because of what's happening with the federal government, the Federal Reserve, all sorts of different things, supply chain issues, all sorts of things that have been impacting our economy and our daily lives, there's more uncertainty than normal. And so this is one, while we wanted to do the numbers, is one that we would highly recommend the community stay away from. We recommend all of the different groups that we forecast for to not go with baseline, and they need to be a little bit more conservative, and maybe in 2025 they might want to shift to a baseline when you see the numbers start to improve.
Okay.
Good. I'm sorry to do this, but I just want to make one point here. Going back to your comment about how well Carefree has been operated, if you look at the FY22 column, the beginning fund balance of $12.6 million is in excess of its ongoing revenues of $9 million and in excess of its ongoing expenditures of under $6 million. Done a pretty good job building up a cash balance. Now, that cash balance is going to be used for lots of one-time expenditures. Roads,
yes,
fire equipment, yes, if we need it. But going to your point about what we're looking at, FY22 starts with $12.68 million. I was going to say billion, but that's not true. $1 million, and at the end of your scenario here, we're all the way down to 3.95 on that beginning balance top row.
That's correct, and this is the more optimistic scenario.
Exactly.
And this is, what you just said is the main reason I made that comment at the beginning. That proper management up through the current period is what allows for a better policy analysis and discussion to occur. It allows for more responsible discussions about what tax rates should be and service levels. And so I think that's understated in the broader analysis so far, and I think people have to be reminded of that point. In fact, I'm thinking during the public outreach, we probably should be highlighting that in bright red as well, because that is what allows a lot of the different things we're going to be talking about to happen.
Maybe not red.
bright, a cheery green.
There you go.
So let's push forward here. If not the baseline, then what?
So you also want to look at a conservative forecast, and in this case, because of the uncertainty, the conservative forecast is really a worst case scenario. And so you end up creating a structural imbalance, which means over a longer period of time, I'll show the numbers in a second, you end up spending more than you're going to be bringing in because of the business cycle. We think that expenditures could end up being understated by a certain percentage because there's just a lot of uncertainty in what's going to happen. What if inflation stays high? All sorts of things that go into it. So there's 10 different bullet point analyses that go into each of these ones. So there's hundreds of things that you have to consider. But even with the conservative forecast, if you look at the numbers, that's where you look at that bottom line, the ending fund balance, going down to a $7 million shortfall by 2030 or by fiscal year 32, but it goes negative in 27, and that's just around the corner. And this is with the reserves going down to zero. And so in a way, even if we sold the farm, so to speak, and put in everything we could, the conservative forecast itself, so if everything was just the worst possible, the town would be in the red. Now, technically, it can't be in the red, but this is what it would be if no additional action happened. Now, we're not necessarily recommending the most conservative forecast because the worst case scenario, while it's very small percentage probability that it could happen, we think that something somewhere in between the baseline and the conservative is the way to go. So we call it the midpoint, but it does have conservative overtones.
Can I interrupt you
Yes,
again? Just for, if you go back to the slide, just so that everybody understands, you're starting with the same cash balance, but in this conservative forecast, you're reducing the amount of revenues that are coming in.
Correct.
Okay, and at the same time, you're increasing the expenditures, the ongoing expenditures, by about 10% a year.
Correct.
So we have less revenue, more expense. That's what's driving us into the negative.
Yes, and something else to point out is the fiscal year 32 is the endpoint in this analysis. That's not the endpoint of the town.
Right.
So if you have if you have these imbalances go to the end of the data, then that means that they're going to continue going forward. So it's something that you really have to take seriously.
Yes.
So midpoint. This is often recommended where we think that it's not going to be as dire as a conservative, but there's going to be some tough things happening. And well, like one of them, the economic recession will be more of a hard landing, even in Arizona, which means it'll dip a little bit more. Our prior forecast was that it was going to look a little bit like 2001. It's not going to look like the Great Recession or like the COVID recession, but it'll look like something that's a little bit more extreme, which means revenues are going to dip more. And sometimes when revenues dip more and you still have these expenditure pressures, that gap will widen. We think that Greater Phoenix is going to be able to be at a reasonable, maintain reasonable level of strength in terms of its ability to bring businesses in and others, and everybody benefits from that. Rising, tide lifts all ships. But we think that inflation in this case will get back to normal. It's not going to get back to normal immediately, but it'll get back to normal maybe a year, year and a half earlier than the conservative scenario. So essentially all of this stuff that is written here is just taking the conservative assumption and moderating it a little bit more. And then that yields different numbers.
Jim, I want to ask you, I want to just make sure I understand this midpoint that you're talking about is not simply an averaging of the best case and the worst case scenarios. You as an economist are actually jimmying with the assumptions here and trying to figure out qualitatively what could be going on here so that we're making what the chief called a nuanced decision, that we're actually thinking in depth about what the financial possibilities are going on here. Is that right?
Correct. So when you take a look at it, in some cases, a midpoint, you want to start with what happens if the rate of growth goes from 3 to 2. Well, that's still in between 3 and 1. Say that's a midpoint, but sometimes the number might be down a little bit closer to conservative. Sometimes it might be a little bit higher. So a lot of thought goes into it, but in the end, it ends up being roughly in the middle, but not quite. It's leaning a little bit more conservative, but it's leaning conservative because the story out there tells us we need to be conservative or the community could be in a lot of trouble if it makes some big decisions right now and the revenues don't come in.
Okay.
And when you say being conservative, your revenues are lower than the baseline, higher than the conservative.
Yes.
And your expenditures are higher than the baseline, but lower than the conservative.
Correct.
So you're shooting a course in between those two, on revenues and on expenditures.
Yeah, we try to put thought because, like you said a number of times, it's a function of revenues and spending. And so we had to take a look at different scenarios. And in some cases, you can make scientific estimates. You can get really technical. In other cases, you got to go with a gut feel on certain data points. But in the end, I just want to let everybody know a lot of thought went into this, and we had a great team to brainstorm with. And so I feel good about the recommendations that we have here. But on this midpoint forecast, I wanted to point out that you end up having this deficit for scenario 1. This is if you deplete the resources, the reserves. So in fiscal year 32, you still have $1 million left in reserves. That's not enough as you're going forward given that there's some other things that could be happening on the negative side. So this isn't selling the farm, but it's selling almost everything. It's just not selling the barn maybe. If you take a look at a scenario where you want to still maintain at least some reserves, which would be about half of what would have been used before, you get into the red in fiscal year 30. It's just barely, but again, fiscal year 29, even fiscal year 27 is in the black, but not by a whole lot. I think a good way of describing this is kind of skating on thin ice, and that's if you want to make it where you aren't just completely exposed as you get into that next decade. And then we had one more where unfortunately the community is very dependent on very few retail establishments. So when we forecast these revenues, when you go through a severe recession, and what if it is more severe, is it possible that maybe a retail establishment could close?
Let's be clear, you're talking about the town of Carefree has a very few number of large retailers who generate a lot of sales tax for the town.
Correct.
Okay.
And you can never forecast if something's going to close, but you can do numbers related to what would it look like if maybe we lost a certain percentage of those revenues on a scenario that is possible. And when we ran those numbers, we ended up with that deficit that got pretty significant by fiscal year 32 at the 4.67 million. So even this midpoint, which is a little bit more optimistic than the conservative, if you want to keep good policy and you want to avoid dramatic problems down the road, you have to be thinking about these things. And I recommend using the midpoint, but this will have to be discussed because that's a level of risk that the town will have to make. But at least from an economist's perspective and our experience with this, we would recommend going with this and also discussing to what extent do you want to leave yourself exposed as you're going to be rolling out of the next recession, because if it's very bad, then you're going to see a lot of red numbers, and that means that things have to happen. You'll have to either cut services or you'll have to increase revenues in some manner. Here's just a quick visual. The blue is the baseline, and that's the one that we would recommend not be used. The midpoint is green, and it just shows a longer-term trend. There's some things going on related to one-time issues and things like that related to the midpoint scenario, but the conservative, it shows the deficit much more severe than the green. The green actually could be manageable. And again, the blue, you don't want to be looking at baseline forecasts until at least 2025 or 2026.
Let me ask you a question about what you just said about it being manageable. Peter made the point before that the 1% sales tax has not historically been adequate to cover all the costs of fire services in the town, and the general fund has been able to cover that. I get that right, Gary?
That is correct.
So my question is, does the midpoint scenario, is it like that? Is it where whatever that downside risk is manageable by the city, or is it completely different than that?
It's manageable, but it's manageable under a discussion of, are there ways to increase revenue that will be supported but also pro-economic development? Like, you don't want to raise a sales tax too high or you end up losing activity. You want to have, if you have a property tax, you have to be competitive. So it's manageable in that there's choices. But right now you have choices because you're predicting ahead of time what level of risk you want. If you wait until the very end and you don't have choices and you have that big hole that you're starting with, then it's the opposite of what we're dealing with now, where we have this great management and that surplus. You don't want to be starting later having this discussion with a severe deficit happening because you didn't get on this earlier in the process.
Peter, that sounds like a Citizens Committee assertion as well, that you would rather make choices up front than have to be backed into a corner later on. Is that right?
Exactly right, and that's why the Citizens Committee recommend that we have a financial analysis like this so that we can see what the road ahead might look like.
Mm-hmm. Chief, let me ask you real quick on the same thing, not the finance side of this, but on the coverage side of this. Is that same thing true? You would rather make choice, you as an expert would rather see the town make choices on the coverage that it has, as opposed to being backed into a corner that it can only afford certain things at some later point?
Yeah, you'd like to see where you're headed so you can make decisions to mitigate or take advantage of those.
Okay, so all of us, at least what I got, we're all in agreement, we're trying to get ahead of the curve on the decision making here. That's really what this whole conversation is about. Jim, I didn't mean to derail you. Go ahead.
No, that was a very good point. That was spot on. So some discussion points. Now, we're not saying that you have to use the midpoint. That really is a policy decision. We're saying that this is what we recommend. We're experts in this area. We've done a lot of recommendations. And this is one area where we strongly recommend using that more conservative midpoint forecast. You have to deal with issues and have discussions about whether or not you want to borrow for some capital, but if you end up paying for it with a higher tax rate, is that going to end up creating a negative economic development condition in the community? That has to be discussed. In some cases, there's no right or wrong, but there's a best path forward. And I would rather take that path that is paved and cleared rather than take the one through the desert and get all scuffed up. And then getting back to that forecast risk, policy decision, but as Peter knows, at the state level, at county levels, at city levels, at town levels, even at your household level, you have to decide to what extent do I want to have some risk in things going awry. But when you're having to manage these things for residents, I think it's the government's duty to make it where that they're not going to be in a precarious position with services or anything else because maybe we were a little bit too optimistic. And then, again, highly dependent on sales taxes already, and that's volatile, so we have to be very careful. So there's going to be we should have a discussion about what the different types of taxes look like in case we need to develop some additional revenues, if that's where people want to go. And we already talked about a small number of businesses make up the majority of the sales taxes. And diversifying the tax base is something, after looking at it, we would also highly recommend. When you have a tax base that's based on different tax revenues, then if something happens in one area, you're hedging against it. You always like to have a couple or three legs of the stool. Well, two actually wouldn't work with the stool, but you always like to at least have two, maybe three revenue sources that helps you get through. Because the
Can
key
you help
is
me understand what that means? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
so
What are those? What are the legs of the stool?
So for example, you get revenue from sales taxes. You could potentially get revenue from property taxes. You get revenue from other fees. Now, if you have balance in where you get your tax revenues, the business cycle may look a little bit like this. If you're overly dependent on an area that ebbs and flows strongly during the business cycle, then revenues will go up and then they'll fall. Now, when they go up, you end up seeing communities think that it's going to continue and then they overspend. Then when they fall, they're having a lot of problems. So you want to stabilize it. And so this may be a discussion point, because if we're going to be talking about additional revenues, if that ends up being part of the discussion as we go forward, we have to discuss, well, what's that right mix? And that gets back to that stereo thing. What's the right mix on taxes to really make sure we can pay for everything here and we can have a competitive economy?
To that point, when the Citizens Committee was considering this, we looked at like 10 or 15 years of sales tax collections, and we measured the year-over-year change in those sales tax collections. And we had some years that the growth was negative 10% or 9%, and we had some years, most recently in 2021, I believe, where sales taxes went up 35%.
Right.
So you have a very volatile revenue source. When one year you could be down 10%, the next year you could be up 35%. When you're dealing with fire is going to be a constant, okay? It's a fixed cost. You would like, in the ideal world, to have a revenue source that matches, that is very stable, and you can pay that bill.
Yes.
If your sales taxes is going up and down, sometimes, well, forecasting's a crapshoot anyway,
Yeah.
but when you're matching it against a fixed cost like fire, you have to be very cautious about it.
Good point.
So Peter, I want to just make sure, what I think I just heard you say was, when we gather for the community conversations and people from the community come together, we're going to be talking about fire coverage, we're going to be talking about the cost, we're going to talk about the affordability, and part of that affordability is going to be, what is the tax base? What are the options that we have as a community to pay for the essential services that we need? Is that right?
And you could also make the community could also make a decision. Remember that the rural metro was like $1.8 million in ongoing cost, at least at a point in time. This analysis is based on the Carefree Fire Department, which is right at $3 million. So you can make a choice. We're going to continue with rural metro. That has a lot of implications, but you're going to save $1.2 million a year. And some of these negative red numbers, you won't see them.
Correct.
Okay. Jim, is there anything else in your presentation, anything else that we want to make sure we get from the insights that you've gleaned from your analysis?
No, what I like is that we just covered different topics, but I think we demonstrated that all of this stuff is so interrelated. It really is one discussion. It's just a very complicated discussion. So we have to make sure that we continue to tell a clear story. And when we do the public outreach, make sure that we tell it in such a way where people will understand what the main points are, what are the risks, what does a risk mean, what does it mean when you're being conservative. And so there's still a little bit of work to be done, but I'm looking forward to it, and my colleagues here are as well.